They're hiding the safe key." 8-year-old Victoria Johnson's voice cut through the ballroom. The music stopped. A few champagne glasses froze halfway to someone's lips. Under the warm glow of crystal chandeliers, dozens of wealthy guests turned toward the small black girl standing near the entrance of Brandon Powell's office. Richard Collins let out a short laugh. "That's quite an imagination," he said. But Victoria didn't look at him. She pointed, straight at his sleeve. The color drained from Richard's face for a split second before he forced another smile. Across the room, billionaire Brandon Powell slowly rose from his chair. Victoria swallowed. Then she said something that made the room even quieter. "He doesn't want anyone opening the safe. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Leave a comment with your country and local time right now. And if you enjoy stories about courage, truth, and unexpected heroes, consider subscribing so you won't miss the next chapter of Victoria's journey." 3 hours earlier. Victoria Johnson sat quietly beside a fogged apartment window on Chicago's South Side. Outside, an elevated train rattled past with its usual roar. The old glass trembled. A cold draft slipped through the corner of the frame. Inside the small apartment, the smell of instant coffee mixed with the toasted bread. Angela Johnson buttoned her work uniform while checking the time on her phone. She looked tired. Not the kind of tired that disappeared after a good night's sleep. The kind that stayed. The kind that came from working 2 jobs and still counting every dollar before payday. Victoria watched her mother carefully. "Are we really going to the rich people's house?" she asked. Angela smiled. "A house, honey. Just a house." Victoria tilted her head. "People say it's bigger than our whole building." Angela laughed softly. "That part might be true." The phone rang. Angela answered immediately. Victoria listened. The woman on the other end spoke quickly. Someone had called in sick. A temporary cleaning worker was needed for a major event at the Powell estate. Angela nodded several times. "Yes, ma'am." "Of course. I'll be there." She ended the call. Victoria already knew what that meant. "We're going," Angela sighed. "Looks like it." Normally, Victoria stayed with a neighbor after school. But the neighbor had left town for the weekend. There was no one else available. Victoria jumped from the chair. She was excited. Not because she cared about rich people. She simply liked seeing new places. An hour later, they boarded a bus heading north. The city slowly changed outside the window. Old brick buildings became newer ones. Busy intersections became cleaner streets. Small grocery stores gave way to expensive boutiques. Victoria rested her chin on the glass. She never said much. She preferred watching. Watching usually taught her more than asking. By late afternoon, they arrived at the Powell estate. Victoria's eyes widened. The property stretched across nearly an entire block overlooking Lake Michigan. Stone walls surrounded the grounds. Tall iron gates stood at the entrance. Workers moved everywhere. Florists carried arrangements. Caterers unloaded supplies. Security guards checked names. The place looked less like a home and more like a movie set. Victoria stared. Angela touched her shoulder. "Remember?" Victoria nodded. "Don't touch things. And don't wander. And," Victoria smiled, "don't act like I belong to the furniture." Angela laughed. That was one of their jokes. No matter where they went, Angela always reminded her that dignity cost nothing. Inside the estate, cool air greeted them. The marble floors reflected the light from giant chandeliers. Everything seemed polished. Everything seemed expensive. Even the silence sounded expensive. Victoria followed her mother through a service hallway. Workers hurried past carrying trays and boxes. Nobody paid much attention to them. That didn't bother Victoria. She was used to being invisible. Near the kitchen entrance, a woman with silver hair approached. Her name tag read Margaret Wilson. "You must be Angela." Angela shook her hand. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret smiled warmly. "Thank goodness you're here." She glanced at Victoria. "And who's this young lady?" "Victoria." Victoria offered her hand. Margaret seemed surprised. Most children didn't do that. She shook it. "Nice to meet you," Victoria smiled. "You too." For a brief moment, Margaret's tired face softened. Then she looked around nervously, as if she suddenly remembered something. A few minutes later, Angela started working. Victoria sat quietly in a corner of the staff lounge with a coloring book. For nearly half an hour, nothing unusual happened. Then she heard voices, 2 adults speaking sharply, not yelling, but close. Victoria looked toward the hallway. The voices came from around the corner. One belonged to Margaret. The other belonged to a man she hadn't seen before. Curious. Victoria peeked carefully. The man wore an expensive navy suit. Perfect haircut, perfect smile, perfect shoes. The kind of person who looked like he never spilled coffee on himself. His badge identified him as Richard Collins. Victoria couldn't hear every word, only pieces. Should stay where it belongs." Margaret folded her arms. "And I still think Mr. Powell should know." Richard's smile disappeared. For only a second. Then it returned. Smooth, practiced, dangerous. "This isn't your concern." Margaret looked unconvinced. "It becomes my concern when things start disappearing." Richard glanced down the hallway. His eyes landed on Victoria. Instantly, the conversation ended. Margaret stepped back. Richard adjusted his tie. The change happened so fast it felt rehearsed. Victoria quickly looked away. A moment later, Richard walked past. His smile returned, but his eyes never did. After he disappeared, Margaret remained standing alone. She looked worried. The kind of worried adults carried when they knew something but weren't ready to say it aloud. Victoria watched for several seconds. Then she returned to her chair. The afternoon continued. Workers rushed everywhere. Guests would begin arriving soon. The entire estate buzzed with activity. Victoria wandered only as far as the employee hallway allowed. She kept her promise to her mother. No touching, no wandering too far, no trouble. Then she heard it. A metallic sound. Tiny, sharp, clink. Victoria stopped. The sound came from near a partially open office door. Nobody else seemed to notice. A worker pushed a cart past. Someone carried flowers. The noise disappeared into the background. But Victoria had heard it. She walked closer, just a few steps. The office appeared empty. Sunlight spilled through the large windows. A massive wooden desk sat in the center. On the floor near one of the desk legs lay a tiny scrap of paper. Victoria hesitated. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, "Don't touch things." She didn't. Instead, she crouched down. The paper wasn't hidden well. It looked as though it had fallen from a folder. She leaned closer. Only a few words were visible. But they were enough. Original donor ledger. Victoria frowned. She didn't know what a donor ledger was, but the word original stood out. Important things usually use that word. She looked around. No one was nearby. No one seemed to be searching for it. Still, something felt strange. Then another voice echoed from the far end of the hallway. Richard Collins. Moving quickly, speaking on the phone. His tone was low, urgent. Victoria couldn't understand everything. Only one sentence. "Make sure nobody opens it before tonight." The words sent a chill through her. Not because she understood them, because of the way he said them. A few seconds later, Richard appeared. He stopped when he noticed Victoria. The smile returned instantly. Again, like a switch. "Lost sweetheart?" he asked. Victoria slowly stood. "No, sir." Richard glanced toward the office, then toward the paper on the floor. For the first time, Victoria saw something flicker across his face. Concern, just for a moment. Then it vanished. "Good," Richard said. "Stay with your mother." He walked away, fast, too fast. Victoria watched him disappear around the corner. Then she looked back toward the paper, toward the office, toward the hallway where Margaret had argued with him. A strange feeling settled in her stomach. She couldn't explain it. She only knew one thing. Something inside this house wasn't right. And somehow Richard Collins seemed connected to all of it. As Victoria continued staring at the scrap of paper on the floor, she heard footsteps approaching behind her. Slow, heavy, purposeful. When she turned around, she saw Brandon Powell himself standing at the end of the hallway, and his eyes were fixed on the office door. Brandon Powell rarely walked through the service hallways of his own estate. Most guests never saw these corridors, the polished ballroom. Yes, the grand staircase, of course, the lakefront terrace, always. But not this place. Not the narrow hallways behind the scenes where workers carried trays, folded linens, and hurried from room to room. Yet, here he was, standing quietly at the far end of the corridor. Victoria immediately recognized him. Almost everyone in Chicago knew who Brandon Powell was. His face appeared on magazine covers, business journals, television interviews. People talked about his billion-dollar developments, his charity work, his influence. But standing only 30 feet away, he looked different. Older, more tired. His shoulders seemed heavier than they appeared on television. Brandon's gaze moved toward the office door, then toward Victoria. For a moment, neither spoke. The hallway remained quiet except for the distant clatter of dishes coming from the kitchen. Victoria suddenly remembered her mother's warning. "Don't wander." She looked down at her shoes. Brandon noticed. A faint smile crossed his face. "You're not supposed to be in here, are you?" Victoria shook her head. "No, sir." His smile widened slightly. "At least you're honest." Victoria nodded. That seemed easier than explaining. Brandon glanced towards the office again. His expression tightened. Then a voice interrupted. "Mr. Powell." Richard Collins appeared from around the corner. Perfect timing. Almost too perfect. The smile returned instantly to his face. "Guests are beginning to arrive." Brandon looked back at him. "I'll be there shortly." Richard's eyes briefly landed on Victoria. Something cold flickered there, something that disappeared before most people would have noticed. But Victoria noticed. She always noticed. Richard smiled. "Everything okay here?" "Fine," Brandon said. Richard nodded. Then he casually stepped between Brandon and the office door. Only for a second. Only a tiny movement. But Victoria saw it. A person protecting something, or someone. The thought settled into her mind. Brandon eventually followed Richard toward the ballroom. Victoria watched them leave. As soon as they disappeared, Margaret Wilson appeared from another hallway. She seemed relieved. "Victoria." The little girl looked up. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret lowered her voice. "You should probably head back to your mother." Victoria nodded. But before leaving, she asked something. "Why was that man angry earlier?" Margaret froze. Just for a second. "What man?" "Mr. Collins." Margaret's eyes drifted toward the office, then back to Victoria. Sometimes adults answered questions. Sometimes they avoided them. This was the second kind. "You should find your mother." Victoria understood. No answer. That usually meant there was one. An hour later, the estate transformed completely. Luxury cars arrived one after another. Guests entered beneath glowing lights. The scent of expensive perfume filled the air. Soft piano music floated through the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers reflected golden light across polished marble floors. Everything sparkled. Everything looked perfect. Victoria sat quietly near one corner while Angela worked nearby. From where she sat, she could see nearly everything. And she watched. A senator speaking with investors. A television reporter interviewing donors. Servers moving through crowds carrying silver trays. People smiled constantly. Yet many of those smiles never reached their eyes. Victoria noticed that too. Across the room, Brandon greeted guests. Everyone wanted his attention. Everyone wanted a photograph. Everyone wanted a conversation. Yet despite the crowd surrounding him, Brandon seemed alone. Victoria watched him pause beside a large portrait hanging near the staircase. A woman smiled from the painting, elegant, kind, peaceful. The plaque beneath it read, "Sarah Powell, beloved wife, mother, and friend." Victoria stared at the portrait, then at Brandon. Something changed in his face when he looked at it. The exhaustion disappeared. The businessman disappeared. For a brief moment, he simply looked like someone who missed another person. Emily Powell approached him. Victoria recognized her from photos online. The resemblance was obvious. Same eyes, same posture. Father and daughter stepped aside to talk privately. Victoria couldn't hear everything, but she caught pieces. Audit? Missing transfers? We need to look deeper." Brandon rubbed his forehead. Emily looked frustrated. Richard appeared seconds later. Again, perfect timing, always nearby, always listening. Victoria noticed that too. Richard handed Brandon a folder. "Everything's in order." His voice sounded calm, confident, practiced. Emily crossed her arms. "According to who?" Richard smiled. "The numbers." Emily didn't smile back. Brandon sighed. Clearly, he didn't want another argument tonight. Not during a charity event, not in front of guests. The conversation ended, but the tension remained, like a storm cloud nobody could see. Later, while servers moved through the ballroom with trays of appetizers, Victoria wandered toward a refreshment station. Still close enough for Angela to see her. Still following the rules. A waiter passed carrying folded white napkins. Victoria's eyes followed him, then stopped. Richard Collins stood beside a table speaking with two donors. As he laughed at something one of them said, his hand slipped beneath a folded napkin. Very quickly, very carefully, almost nobody would have noticed. But Victoria did. Something small disappeared beneath the fabric, something metallic. Richard immediately folded the napkin again. Conversation continued. No one reacted. Victoria frowned. That was strange. She watched for several more seconds. Then Richard picked up the napkin and casually handed it to a security guard standing nearby. The guard accepted it without question. The exchange lasted less than 2 seconds. Victoria blinked. The napkin was gone. The security guard continued walking. Richard returned to smiling, to talking, to pretending nothing unusual had happened. Victoria glanced around. No one else seemed to have seen it. Not Brandon, not Emily, not the guests, nobody. For the first time that evening, Victoria felt something stronger than curiosity, concern, a small uncomfortable feeling in her stomach. The kind that appeared when pieces didn't fit together. She thought about the argument, the office, the paper, the metallic sound. Now, this. The pieces weren't connected yet, but they felt close, very close. A few minutes later, Angela found her near the refreshment table. "What are you thinking about?" Victoria pointed toward Richard. "That man." Angela immediately lowered her voice. "Honey. He keeps doing strange things." Angela looked over. Richard was laughing with donors. Perfectly professional, perfectly normal. Sometimes grown-up business looks strange. Victoria considered that. Maybe. But she wasn't convinced. She watched Richard again. Then she quietly said, "Sometimes small things tell the truth because big people forget to hide them." Angela looked down at her daughter. The words sounded simple, childish even, yet something about them lingered. Victoria kept watching the room. Across the ballroom, the security guard who had received the folded napkin suddenly exited through a side door. Alone. No tray, no guests, no reason she could see. Just the napkin. Victoria's eyes widened. There. That was it. That was the thing bothering her. The guard wasn't carrying food, wasn't carrying supplies. Only the folded napkin Richard had handed him. The side door slowly closed behind him. Victoria stared. Every instinct told her the napkin mattered, and whatever was hidden inside it mattered even more. Without realizing it, she took a step toward the hallway, then another. Just as the door disappeared from view, the side door closed with a soft click. Victoria stood frozen for a moment. The sounds of the ballroom continued behind her, piano music, laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses. But somehow those sounds felt farther away now, like they belonged to another world. She glanced back toward her mother. Angela was helping another employee arrange table linens near the far side of the room. Victoria knew she shouldn't leave. She knew it. Yet the image of that folded napkin stayed in her mind. The security guard had carried it away as if it mattered, as if someone had trusted him with something important. Victoria took a careful step toward the hallway, then another. The corridor beyond the ballroom felt cooler, quieter. The golden glow of the party faded behind her. White overhead lights replaced it. The air smelled faintly of cleaning products and polished wood. She followed the direction the guard had gone, not running, just walking, listening, watching. The hallway eventually split into two directions. Victoria stopped. She wasn't sure which way he had gone. Then she heard voices, low, muffled, coming from the left. She moved closer. A storage room door stood slightly open. Inside, the security guard handed the folded napkin back to Richard Collins. Victoria's eyes widened. Richard unfolded it quickly. Something metallic glimmered beneath the fluorescent light. A key. Not a house key, not a car key. Larger, heavier. Richard immediately slipped it into a glass filled with ice sitting on a nearby cart. The key disappeared among the cubes. The security guard looked nervous. "Are you sure this is necessary?" Richard's smile vanished. "Do your job." The guard lowered his eyes. "Yes, sir." Victoria ducked back before they could see her. Her heart pounded. A key, definitely a key, but why hide it inside a glass of ice that made no sense, unless someone was looking for it? Footsteps approached. Victoria hurried away. She rounded a corner just as Richard exited the storage room. She pressed herself against the wall. The smell of fresh paint filled the narrow passage. Richard walked past without noticing her. His attention remained fixed on his phone. A few seconds later, Victoria peeked around the corner. Richard was already gone. She waited, then slowly returned toward the ballroom. The party had become even busier. Guests filled nearly every corner. Servers moved continuously through the crowd. Victoria immediately searched for the cart she had seen. It didn't take long. A waiter pushed it through the room carrying glasses packed with ice. One of those glasses contained the key, somewhere. Victoria followed from a distance. The waiter stopped near a group of donors, then near the stage, then beside the buffet area. Every time he moved, Victoria's anxiety grew. The key could disappear again at any moment. She tried to keep track, but the ballroom was crowded, too crowded. The waiter eventually stopped beside a service station. Another employee approached. They exchanged trays. For one terrifying moment, Victoria lost sight of the glass. Her stomach dropped. Then she found it again. Still there, still packed with ice, still hiding whatever Richard wanted hidden. Across the room, Brandon Powell stood near the stage greeting major donors. He looked calm, confident, successful, the perfect host. Yet, Victoria couldn't stop thinking about the key, or Richard, or the argument she'd overheard earlier. Something connected them all. She simply didn't know how. A burst of applause suddenly filled the ballroom. Brandon had stepped onto the stage. The microphone crackled softly. The piano music stopped. Hundreds of eyes turned toward him. "Thank you all for being here tonight." The audience applauded again. Victoria barely listened. Her attention remained fixed on the glass. As Brandon spoke about helping families displaced by apartment fires, Victoria noticed Richard standing near the back of the room, watching. Not Brandon, not the guests. The glass, the same glass. The realization made her uneasy. Richard wasn't protecting money. He wasn't protecting jewelry. He was protecting that key. Why, the speech ended. More applause. Guests returned to their conversations. The waiter picked up the glass again. Victoria followed. This time, the route led toward a quieter hallway near Brandon's private office. The hallway carpet muffled every sound. Framed photographs lined the walls. Family vacations, charity events, award ceremonies. Victoria slowed. Something felt wrong. Ahead, the waiter stopped. Richard emerged from another corridor. Without speaking, he lifted the glass, reached inside, and removed the key. The ice clinked softly. Then he slipped the key into the inside pocket of his jacket. Gone. Just like that. Victoria stared. Richard glanced around. For a second, she thought he had seen her, but his attention moved elsewhere, toward Brandon's office. Richard quickly disappeared into the hallway. Victoria waited several seconds before following. The office door stood partially open. Light spilled across the floor. Inside, she heard movement. Papers, drawers, metal. Then silence. Victoria edged closer. Not enough to enter, just enough to see. Richard emerged carrying a thin manila envelope. His expression looked tense, focused, almost desperate. He locked the office behind him, checked the hallway, then walked away. The envelope remained tucked beneath his arm. Victoria stared at the office door. Locked, the key gone, the envelope gone. Something important had just happened. She was sure of it. Suddenly, another voice startled her. "Victoria, Angela." The little girl spun around. Her mother hurried toward her. Relief flooded Angela's face, immediately followed by concern. "There you are." Victoria lowered her head. "Sorry. I told you not to wander." "I know." Angela knelt beside her. The scent of lemon cleaning spray lingered on her uniform. "Were you lost?" Victoria hesitated. "No." "Then why are you here?" The answer sat on the tip of her tongue. "Because Richard is hiding something. Because there's a key. Because something is wrong." But how could she explain that she was 8, and Richard Collins was one of the most trusted executives in the building? Angela gently touched her shoulder. "Come on." Victoria nodded. As they walked back toward the ballroom, she looked over her shoulder one last time. At the office, at the locked door, at the hallway now standing empty. The feeling in her stomach returned. Stronger this time. Back inside the ballroom, the atmosphere seemed brighter than ever. Music played, champagne flowed. Guests laughed. Nobody appeared worried. Nobody appeared suspicious. Yet, Victoria noticed something nobody else seemed to notice. Margaret Wilson stood near service entrance, watching Richard. Not casually, not accidentally, watching him carefully. Like someone waiting for confirmation. Like someone who already suspected the truth. Their eyes met briefly across the room. Margaret looked away first. And in that moment, Victoria realized she wasn't the only person who thought something was wrong. A few minutes later, another employee hurried toward Margaret carrying a clipboard. The older woman glanced down at the page, then froze. The color drained from her face. Victoria couldn't hear what was said, but she saw Margaret whisper only 3 words. 3 words that made her grip the clipboard tighter. "It's missing." Victoria's pulse quickened. Whatever Margaret had just discovered was important. Very important. And somehow Victoria knew it was connected to the key. Connected to Richard. Connected to the office. Then, across the ballroom, Richard Collins smiled at a group of donors as if nothing had happened at all. The rest of the evening should have felt festive. For everyone else, it probably did. Music drifted through the ballroom. The smell of roasted steak and fresh bread floated from the dining area. Laughter echoed beneath the chandeliers. Outside, Lake Michigan reflected thousands of city lights. Inside, however, Victoria could not stop thinking about Richard Collins, or the key, or Margaret's reaction when she discovered something was missing. The pieces kept circling in her head, like puzzle pieces waiting to connect. Angela returned to her work. Victoria remained near one of the side walls where she could watch the room without being noticed. Watching was easy. People rarely paid attention to children, especially children who didn't belong among wealthy guests. A waiter passed, carrying a tray of sparkling water. A couple laughed near the dance floor. Several donors discussed business near the stage. Everything looked normal, yet Richard kept appearing in the corners of Victoria's vision. Always moving, always watching, always somewhere close to Brandon Powell. Victoria followed him with her eyes. She noticed something. Every few minutes, Richard touched the sleeve of his suit jacket, not casually, not absent-mindedly, purposefully, as if checking whether something remained there. The observation settled into her mind. Moments later, Emily Powell approached her father again. Victoria watched from across the room. Emily spoke quietly. Brandon listened. Richard joined them almost immediately. Again. Perfect timing, every single time. Emily's jaw tightened. Richard smiled. Brandon rubbed the bridge of his nose. The conversation lasted less than a minute before Emily walked away. Frustrated, Richard remained. Victoria frowned. Something about that bothered her. A person protecting information often stayed close. A person hiding information stayed even closer. The thought lingered. An hour passed. The fundraiser entered its busiest period. More donations were announced. More speeches were given. Applause filled the ballroom repeatedly. Then Victoria noticed Margaret again. The elderly house manager stood near a service station reviewing inventory sheets. Her eyes repeatedly drifted toward Richard. Not openly, carefully, like someone trying not to be seen. Victoria walked closer, not enough to interrupt, just enough to observe. Margaret suddenly looked up. Their eyes met. For a brief second, neither spoke. Then Margaret quietly motioned Victoria toward her. The little girl approached. "Yes, ma'am." Margaret glanced around first, making sure nobody important stood nearby. Then she lowered her voice. "You notice things, don't you?" Victoria blinked. "A little." Margaret almost smiled. "A little." Victoria shrugged. Margaret studied her face, then sighed. "Never mind." The older woman looked as though she wanted to say more, but she didn't. Instead, she returned to her clipboard. The conversation ended. Yet, it confirmed something. Margaret was worried, very worried, and whatever she feared involved Richard. Across the room, Brandon climbed onto the stage again. Another speech, another announcement, another round of applause. The fundraiser had already raised millions of dollars. Guests seemed thrilled. But Victoria noticed Brandon's smile wasn't as relaxed as before. Something weighed on him. Something deeper than tonight's event. As Brandon thanked donors, Victoria's attention shifted back toward Richard, and that's when she heard it. A sentence. Small, quick, easy to miss. Richard stood beside two investors near the bar. One of them joked about how busy the staff looked tonight. Richard laughed, then casually said, "Nobody notices what the staff carries anyway." The investors chuckled. The conversation moved on. But Victoria froze. A strange chill moved through her. Nobody notices what the staff carries. The words sounded harmless. Yet she immediately remembered the security guard, the napkin, the hidden key, the service hallways, everything. Across the room, Margaret heard it too. Victoria knew because she saw the older woman's expression change. Just slightly. A tightening around the eyes. A silent reaction. Richard never noticed. That was the irony. He believed the staff were invisible. So invisible that he forgot they could hear him. Forgot they could remember. Forgot they could become witnesses. Victoria watched Margaret lower her eyes and continue working. But the words clearly stayed with her, just as they stayed with Victoria. The evening moved forward. Guests gathered near the dessert tables. Coffee was served. The scent of chocolate and cinnamon filled the air. A jazz trio began playing near the ballroom entrance. Yet, beneath the elegant atmosphere, tension slowly grew. Victoria could feel it. Not because she understood finances, not because she understood corporate fraud. She simply understood people. Richard looked nervous. Not visibly nervous, not enough for most adults to notice, but Victoria noticed. Every few minutes he adjusted his sleeve. Every few minutes he scanned the room. Every few minutes he checked his phone. Then something unexpected happened. One of the estate's technicians hurried across the ballroom. Another followed, then another. Their faces looked concerned. A few moments later, Victoria heard someone whisper, "The hallway cameras are down." Another employee responded. "What happened?" "No idea." The employees disappeared through a side door. Victoria's attention sharpened instantly. Hallway cameras, down. She looked toward Richard. His expression remained calm. Too calm. The timing felt wrong. Very wrong. Within minutes, whispers spread among several staff members. The camera system covering the private office corridor had lost signal. Not the entire estate, only that section. Only the area near Brandon's office. Victoria's stomach tightened. That couldn't be a coincidence. Could it? She looked toward Margaret. The older woman clearly shared the same concern. Their eyes met again. Neither said a word. Across the ballroom, Emily Powell was speaking urgently with someone from security. Brandon appeared confused. Richard approached immediately. Of course he did. Victoria watched him place a reassuring hand on Brandon's shoulder. Probably a technical issue. His voice sounded smooth, confident, comforting. The kind of voice people trusted. Brandon nodded slowly. But Emily didn't look convinced, not at all. She crossed her arms. Her gaze remained fixed on Richard. The silence between them said more than words. For the first time that night, Victoria wondered if Emily saw the same things she did. Maybe not all of them, but enough. Enough to know something wasn't right. The music continued. The party continued. The cameras remained down. And Richard Collins remained unusually calm. A calmness that looked less like confidence and more like preparation. Victoria's eyes drifted toward his sleeve again. There, another adjustment. Quick, subtle, protective. Something was still hidden there. She was almost sure of it. And whatever it was, connected directly to the office corridor. Connected to the missing document. Connected to the key. connected to everything. Then, suddenly a voice came through the ballroom speakers. One of the security supervisors. There was a slight edge in his tone, a slight urgency. "Ladies and gentlemen, please continue enjoying the evening. We're experiencing a minor technical issue." Guests barely reacted. Most returned to their conversations. But Victoria noticed Brandon's face. The billionaire no longer looked relaxed. He looked concerned. Very concerned. Because the technical issue wasn't happening just anywhere. It was happening outside his private office. And at that exact moment, Richard quietly slipped his hand back to his sleeve, as if checking one final time that something was still there. The music continued. The guests continued talking. The fundraiser continued raising money. Yet beneath the polished surface of the evening, something had shifted. Victoria could feel it. The air itself seemed different, heavier, tenser. The outage affecting the hallway cameras had not been resolved. Staff members moved quickly through the estate. Security personnel spoke quietly into radios. No one wanted guests to notice. But Victoria noticed. She always noticed. Across the ballroom, Brandon Powell stood beside a group of major donors. He smiled, shook hands, thanked people for their generosity, but every few minutes his attention drifted toward the private office corridor, toward the area where the cameras had failed, toward the problem nobody seemed eager to discuss. Meanwhile, Richard Collins looked completely relaxed, too relaxed. He laughed at jokes, spoke confidently with guests, discussed future charity projects. If someone didn't know better, they would think nothing was wrong. Victoria knew better. She watched him adjust his sleeve again. The movement lasted less than a second. But she saw it, and so did Emily Powell. Victoria noticed Emily staring directly at Richard's arm, the same sleeve, the same place. Interesting. Very interesting. A few minutes later, Emily approached her father. This time, she didn't look willing to wait. "Can we talk?" Brandon sighed. "Now." "Yes." The answer came immediately. Firm, serious. Brandon nodded. The two stepped away from the crowd. Richard started to follow. Emily stopped walking, turned around, and looked directly at him. "We need a private conversation." For the first time all evening, Richard's smile weakened, only slightly, but enough. He stepped back. Of course. Emily and Brandon disappeared into a quieter lounge. Richard remained outside, watching, waiting. Victoria didn't trust that look, not at all. Several minutes passed. Then another unexpected arrival changed everything. A tall man entered through the ballroom entrance accompanied by a security supervisor. Dark suit, short gray hair, calm eyes, professional posture. His badge identified him as Detective Marcus Reed. Victoria didn't know much about detectives, but she knew one thing. Police officers usually weren't invited to charity parties for fun. Marcus spoke briefly with security, then with Emily, then with Brandon. The three stood together for nearly 10 minutes. Richard eventually joined them. The moment he arrived, the atmosphere changed. Victoria could feel it from across the room. Nobody smiled. Nobody laughed. Nobody looked comfortable. The detective asked questions. Richard answered. Emily listened. Brandon remained silent. Finally, the conversation ended. Richard walked away. His jaw looked tighter than before. The detective remained, watching, observing. Victoria liked him immediately, not because he was a detective, because he seemed like the kind of person who listened before speaking, the kind of person who noticed things, a lot like her. The evening continued. Guests remained unaware. Most believed the event was running perfectly. Then trouble arrived. Real trouble. Victoria had wandered only a few feet from her mother when a security guard suddenly appeared. Not the same guard from earlier, a different one. "Excuse me." Victoria looked up. The man seemed uncomfortable, as if he didn't want this conversation. "Can you come with me?" Angela immediately stepped forward. "Why?" The guard hesitated. Then another voice answered. "Richard Collins." "Nothing serious." His smile appeared again. The same polished smile, the same practiced smile, the same fake smile. "We simply have a few questions." Angela frowned. "Questions about what?" Richard folded his hands. "We found someone near the restricted office corridor earlier." Victoria felt her stomach drop. Richard continued. "A child." Silence. Angela looked at Victoria, then back at Richard. "She wasn't causing trouble." "I'm sure she wasn't." Richard's voice sounded pleasant. Too pleasant. "But important documents have gone missing." The words landed like stones. Angela's eyes widened. "What are you saying?" Richard raised his hands. "Nothing. We simply need to be careful." Victoria stared at him. Important documents. Missing. And suddenly he was looking at her. Not the office, not the cameras, not the missing key. Her. The realization hit hard. He was redirecting attention. Marcus Reed approached, his expression unreadable. "What's happening?" Richard turned smoothly. "The child was seen near the office earlier." Marcus looked at Victoria, then at Angela, then at Richard. Unlike Richard, he didn't rush. He simply asked, "And?" Richard blinked. The detective continued, "And what evidence suggests she took anything?" The question hung in the air. Richard's smile tightened. "No evidence yet." Yet. Victoria noticed that word. Marcus noticed it too. His eyes narrowed slightly. Interesting. Very interesting. The detective crouched until he was eye level with Victoria. "What were you doing near the hallway?" Victoria answered honestly. "Walking." A faint smile touched his face. "Fair enough." She hesitated, then added, "I saw people doing things." Marcus waited. She waited too. Neither spoke. Finally, Angela gently squeezed her shoulder. Victoria stayed quiet. She wasn't sure who she could trust yet. Marcus stood. Richard immediately stepped forward. "There may be another explanation." The detective looked at him. Richard lowered his voice. "Children sometimes become curious around expensive things." The statement sounded harmless. Reasonable, even. But Victoria understood what he was doing. So did Angela. The temperature in the room suddenly felt colder. Angela crossed her arms. "My daughter knows right from wrong." Richard smiled. "I'm sure she does." Again, that smile. Victoria was beginning to hate it. Nearby, several staff members had stopped working. Watching, listening, Margaret Wilson among them. The older woman stood perfectly still. A serving tray rested in her hands. Her eyes never left Richard. Not once. The room remained quiet. Then Victoria spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, simply, clearly. "Being poor doesn't make your hands dirty." Everyone looked at her. She swallowed, then continued, "Taking what isn't yours does." Silence, complete silence. Even Richard stopped smiling. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. The only sound came from distant music drifting in from the ballroom. Marcus Reed slowly looked toward Richard, then toward Victoria, then back toward Richard again. Something changed in his expression. Not suspicion, interest. The detective was starting to pay attention. Richard recovered first. His smile returned. "We're getting distracted." There it was again, redirecting, always redirecting. Then he looked at the security supervisor standing nearby. "Perhaps we should check the girls' pockets." Angela stepped forward instantly. "No." The word came out sharp, protective, fierce. Several guests had begun noticing the scene. Heads turned, conversations slowed, the tension spread. Richard remained calm, almost eager. Victoria suddenly understood why. He expected them to find nothing, because he knew she hadn't taken anything. This wasn't about evidence, it was about embarrassment. About making sure nobody believed her later. About making sure an 8-year-old girl's voice became easy to ignore. Marcus Reed glanced at Victoria, then at Richard, then at the growing crowd around them. The detective's face hardened, and for the first time that night Victoria felt certain of one thing. Something much bigger was about to happen. The ballroom no longer felt like a celebration. The music still played. Guests still held crystal glasses. Servers still moved through the crowd. But an uncomfortable tension now lingered beneath everything. People sensed it, even if they didn't understand it. A small circle had formed around Victoria, Angela, Richard, Brandon, Emily, and Detective Marcus Reed. Some guests pretended not to stare. Others made no effort to hide it. Whispers spread quietly. What happened? Who's the little girl? Why is security involved? Victoria stood beside her mother. Her small hand gripped Angela's fingers tightly. Angela's heart pounded. Victoria could feel it. Yet her mother's posture never wavered. She stood straight, protective, ready. Richard Collins looked completely composed, at least on the surface. He adjusted his cufflinks, smoothed his jacket, maintained his professional smile. The same smile Victoria had learned not to trust. Marcus Reed glanced around the gathering crowd, then at Richard. "You want her searched?" Richard nodded. "Only to eliminate possibilities." Eliminate possibilities. Victoria noticed how carefully he chose his words. Not accuse, not suspect, eliminate. A cleaner word, a safer word, one that sounded reasonable. Brandon remained silent. His jaw tightened slightly. Emily folded her arms, clearly unhappy. Angela took a step forward. "My daughter hasn't stolen anything." Richard offered another polished smile. "Then there shouldn't be a problem." Victoria watched him. Something felt wrong. Not because she feared being searched, because Richard seemed too confident, as if the search itself mattered more than the result. Marcus noticed it too. The detective looked toward Victoria. "Do you understand what's happening?" Victoria nodded. "Yes. Do you have anything that belongs to Mr. Powell?" "No." Marcus studied her face. The little girl didn't look frightened. She looked annoyed. That surprised him. Most children would have cried by now. Victoria simply looked tired of being treated like the problem. A female security officer was called over. She knelt beside Victoria. Her voice sounded gentle. "This will only take a moment." Victoria nodded. The ballroom seemed to hold its breath. The officer carefully checked Victoria's jacket pockets. Nothing. Her small purse. Nothing. Her sweater. Nothing. Silence. The officer stood. Nothing found. A ripple moved through the crowd. Richard's smile flickered. Only for a second. Only long enough for Victoria to catch it. Disappointment. Then it disappeared. The mask returned. "Well," Richard said lightly, "that's good news." Victoria stared at him. If he was truly relieved, why had he looked disappointed? The answer felt obvious. Because this was never about finding evidence. It was about making people doubt her. And now that plan had failed. Marcus Reed seemed to reach the same conclusion. His eyes narrowed slightly. Nearby, Emily Powell looked directly at Richard. Not speaking. Just watching. Like a lawyer studying a witness. The tension grew. Richard quickly tried to regain control. "We can move on now." But nobody moved. Nobody left. Something had changed. The guests might not know every detail, yet they knew enough to sense a story unfolding. Brandon finally spoke. His deep voice cut through the silence. Why were the cameras down? The question landed hard. Richard blinked, only once, then smiled. A technical issue. Only in one hallway. Richard nodded. That's what I've been told. Emily immediately spoke. Convenient. Several guests exchanged glances. Richard's jaw tightened, barely. But Victoria saw it. Brandon saw it too. The billionaire looked exhausted, not angry, not yet, just tired. Tired of uncertainty, tired of questions. Tired of feeling as though something important sat just beyond his reach. Across the room, Margaret Wilson stood holding a serving tray. She had not moved for several minutes. Victoria noticed her hands. The older woman gripped the tray so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Margaret knew something. Victoria was sure of it. The elderly house manager looked toward Richard, then quickly looked away, like someone carrying a secret too heavy to hold much longer. Meanwhile, Richard attempted to redirect the conversation again. We should focus on the fundraiser. No one answered. Marcus Reed spoke instead. I'd like access to the camera logs. Richard immediately replied. Of course. Too quickly, much too quickly. Marcus noticed, so did Emily. Victoria watched Richard's fingers again. That same movement. His hand brushed his sleeve. A quick adjustment. Protective, instinctive. As though checking on something hidden, the gesture had become impossible to ignore. And Victoria wasn't the only one seeing it anymore. Near the ballroom entrance stood a young waiter. Maybe 20 years old, maybe younger. He had been serving drinks all evening. Now he stared at Richard's arm. Watching, thinking, remembering. Victoria recognized him. The same waiter who had pushed the cart carrying the ice-filled glass. Interesting. Very interesting. A second witness. Across the room, Margaret noticed it too. The waiter, Richard's sleeve, everything. The pieces were beginning to connect. The truth was no longer living only inside Victoria's head. Others were seeing it. Others were noticing. Richard sensed the shift. His smile became tighter. His eyes moved more frequently. The confidence remained. But cracks had begun to appear. Then Brandon suddenly looked at Victoria. The room quieted again. The billionaire studied her carefully. Not as a suspect, not as a child, as a person. What exactly were you trying to tell everyone earlier? Victoria swallowed. Every eye in the room seemed fixed on her. Angela squeezed her hand. Emily waited. Marcus waited. Even Richard waited. Victoria thought carefully, then answered. The thing you're looking for isn't where people keep looking. Silence. Richard immediately laughed, a little too loudly. A riddle. Victoria ignored him. She kept her eyes on Brandon. You keep looking at me. She pointed toward herself. Because I'm easy to see. The room became quieter. Victoria continued. But the thing you're missing is close to the person who wants everyone looking somewhere else. A chill spread through the crowd. No dramatic accusation. No yelling. Just simple words. The kind a child would use, yet somehow they landed harder than any speech. Marcus Reed slowly turned toward Richard. Emily did the same. Margaret lowered her gaze. The young waiter looked nervous. Richard's smile returned. But now it looked forced, artificial. His fingers drifted toward his sleeve once more. Victoria noticed. The waiter noticed. Margaret noticed. Marcus noticed. For the first time all evening, Richard seemed aware that people were watching him. Really watching him. Not listening to his words. Watching his actions. Watching his habits. Watching the places his hands kept returning. And that made him uncomfortable. Very uncomfortable. Victoria took a small step forward. The crowd parted slightly. She pointed. Not at Richard's face, not at his chest, at his sleeve, straight at his sleeve. Then she spoke the words that would change the entire night. "They're hiding the safe key." The ballroom froze. Every conversation stopped, every movement stopped, even the music seemed distant. Brandon stared at Victoria, then at Richard. Emily's eyes widened. Marcus Reed's expression hardened. The young waiter nearly dropped his tray. Across the room, Margaret Wilson slowly closed her eyes, as if a truth she had feared was finally being spoken aloud, and for the first time all evening Richard Collins looked afraid. The ballroom fell silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that arrives when nobody knows what to say next. Victoria's arm remained extended. Her finger pointed directly at Richard Collins. The crystal chandeliers glowed overhead. The jazz trio had stopped playing. Even the servers stood frozen with trays in their hands. Nobody moved, nobody spoke. For several long seconds, all eyes remained fixed on Richard. The billionaire, the detective, the guests, the staff, everyone. Richard stared back at Victoria. Then he laughed, a sharp laugh. Too sharp, too fast. The sound echoed strangely through the room. "That's ridiculous." Nobody joined his laughter. Nobody. The reaction seemed to surprise him. Only slightly, but Victoria saw it. Brandon Powell took one slow step forward. His expensive shoes barely made a sound against the polished floor. "Victoria." His voice remained calm. "What exactly do you mean?" Victoria swallowed. She suddenly became aware of how many people were watching her. Yet she didn't look away. "He keeps touching his sleeve." Richard immediately folded his arms, as if trying to hide the movement. The gesture only made things worse. Emily noticed. Marcus Reed noticed. Several guests noticed. The young waiter noticed. Margaret Wilson noticed. Richard realized it too late. A brief flash of irritation crossed his face, then disappeared. Victoria continued. "I saw a key." The room remained still. "A key hidden in a glass of ice." Several guests exchanged confused glances. Richard shook his head. "This is absurd." Victoria ignored him. "I saw him put it there." Richard's jaw tightened. Marcus Reed spoke calmly. "You saw this yourself?" Victoria nodded. "Yes." "Where?" "In the hallway." "When?" "Before the cameras stopped working." That answer landed heavily, very heavily. The detective's eyes sharpened immediately. Richard stepped forward. Now his voice carried a slight edge. "A child is confused." Emily crossed her arms. "Maybe." Then she looked directly at him. "Or maybe she isn't." The room grew even quieter. Brandon's gaze shifted from Victoria to Richard, back and forth, studying, evaluating. For the first time all evening uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Not uncertainty about Victoria. Uncertainty about Richard, the man he had trusted for over a decade. Richard sensed it. Everyone sensed it. The ground beneath him was beginning to shift. Marcus Reed stepped closer. "Mr. Collins." Richard forced a smile. "Yes. I'd like you to remain here while we clarify a few things." The smile became thinner. "Am I being accused of something?" "No." Marcus's tone remained steady. "Not yet." That answer made several guests uncomfortable. Whispers began spreading through the crowd. Richard glanced toward the ballroom exit. Only for a moment. But Victoria noticed, so did Emily. The detective noticed too. Interesting. Very interesting. Then Brandon raised a hand. Immediately the room quieted. Nobody wanted to interrupt him. "Everyone, stay where you are." His voice carried authority. Years of authority. Years of leadership. Years of being obeyed. The room listened. Richard smiled again. But now the smile looked strained, like a crack spreading across glass. A phone vibrated somewhere nearby. Nobody answered it. Nobody cared. All attention remained focused on the confrontation unfolding beneath the chandeliers. Then, something unexpected happened. Richard took a small step backward. Tiny, barely noticeable, toward the ballroom exit. Emily saw it first. "Where are you going?" Richard stopped. "I have an urgent call." Nobody believed him, not even the guests. The excuse arrived too quickly, too conveniently. Marcus Reed moved slightly to the side, blocking the most direct path, not aggressively, just enough to make leaving difficult. The detective's posture remained calm, yet the message was clear. Stay. Richard looked toward Brandon, perhaps hoping the billionaire would intervene. Brandon did not. That worried him. Victoria could see it. The confidence that had surrounded Richard all evening was slowly disappearing, like air leaking from a balloon. Then Marcus spoke. "Victoria." The little girl looked up. "You said he keeps touching his sleeve." "Yes." "Which sleeve?" "The left one." Every eye immediately shifted toward Richard's left arm. His face changed, only slightly, but enough. The detective saw it, Emily saw it, Brandon saw it, Margaret saw it. The young waiter nearly stopped breathing. The room seemed to shrink. Richard suddenly laughed again, forced, artificial. "Are we seriously doing this?" Nobody answered. Marcus took another step forward, not threatening, not dramatic, simply professional. "Mr. Collins." Richard's smile vanished. "What?" "I'd like you to remove your jacket." The words struck like lightning. Gasps rippled through the crowd. A donor dropped a napkin. Someone's champagne glass nearly slipped. Richard froze. The reaction lasted less than a second, yet it told everyone everything. An innocent person would have been annoyed, confused, offended. Richard looked afraid, and fear is difficult to hide, especially when it arrives unexpectedly. Brandon saw it. The billionaire's expression darkened. Emily slowly shook her head, almost as if a terrible suspicion had finally become real. Marcus waited, patient, silent. Richard remained motionless. The detective spoke again. "Please." Another pause. Then Richard slowly removed his jacket. The room watched. Nobody looked away. The fabric slipped from his shoulders. Nothing happened. For one brief moment, Richard seemed relieved. Then disaster struck. A small metallic object fell from inside the sleeve. Clink. The sound echoed across the ballroom floor. Tiny, sharp, unmistakable. Everyone stared. The object bounced once against the marble, then came to rest beneath the chandelier light. Victoria recognized it immediately. So did Marcus. So did Emily. So did Margaret. The young waiter nearly dropped his tray, a fragment of a key, not the entire key, only part of it. But enough to destroy Richard's carefully built story. Silence filled the ballroom. Richard's face turned pale, very pale. The detective crouched, picked up the metal piece, examined it carefully, then stood. Nobody spoke, nobody dared. Finally, Richard found his voice. "That's not what it looks like." A terrible sentence, the kind guilty people always seem to say. Marcus turned the metal piece over in his hand. Brandon stared at it. His expression had become unreadable, cold, controlled, dangerous. The billionaire looked at Richard. For the first time all evening, there was no trust left in his eyes. None. Still, Richard refused to surrender. His voice became desperate. "It isn't a safe key." Marcus remained calm. "No," Richard shook his head. "It's from a wine cabinet." Several guests looked skeptical. Emily looked openly unconvinced. Victoria looked at the detective. Marcus studied the metal carefully, then slipped it into an evidence pouch. The action sent another wave of whispers through the crowd. Evidence, not curiosity. Evidence, the difference mattered. A lot. Then Marcus looked directly at Richard. Maybe you're right. Hope briefly returned to Richard's face. Then the detective continued. Let's verify that. The hope vanished immediately, because everyone in the room knew the same thing. Verification meant answers. Answers meant facts. And facts were becoming very dangerous for Richard Collins. Meanwhile, Victoria stared at the metal fragment. Something still bothered her. The key piece was real, important. But one question remained. If this was truly the safe key, why was it only part of one? And where was the rest? Nobody returned to the party. Not really. The music remained off. The dessert tables sat untouched. Champagne glasses rested forgotten on silver trays. The fundraiser that had seemed so elegant only minutes earlier now felt like a courtroom without a judge. Everyone wanted answers, especially Brandon Powell. The billionaire stood motionless near the center of the ballroom. The fragment of metal in Marcus Reed's evidence pouch seemed heavier than steel. It represented doubt, betrayal, questions, too many questions. Richard Collins tried to regain control. The piece proves nothing. His voice sounded strained, tighter than before. Marcus nodded calmly. Maybe. Richard immediately seized the opening. Exactly. The detective held up a hand. Maybe it proves nothing by itself. Richard's brief relief disappeared. Marcus continued. But evidence rarely arrives alone. Silence followed. The detective turned toward Victoria. The little girl stood beside Angela, still holding her mother's hand, still calm, still certain. Marcus crouched again so they were eye level. Victoria. Yes, sir. You said you saw a key. Yes? Tell me everything. Victoria nodded. She took her time. Unlike most adults, she didn't rush. She started with the hallway. The folded napkin, the security guard, the glass of ice. Richard removing something from it, the office corridor, the locked door. Every detail, every observation. Nothing more, nothing less. The room listened. Nobody interrupted. Even Richard remained silent. The story sounded simple, yet its consistency made it powerful. Victoria never exaggerated, never guessed, never claimed certainty about things she hadn't seen. She only described what had happened. Marcus noticed that. So did Brandon. So did Emily. When Victoria finished, the detective slowly stood. Then another voice spoke, a nervous voice. The young waiter, the same waiter who had pushed the cart earlier. His hands shook slightly. I think I saw the glass. Every head turned. The young man swallowed, then continued. It was on my service cart. Richard immediately reacted. That doesn't prove anything. Marcus looked toward him. Nobody asked you. The room became even quieter. The waiter continued. I remember because Mr. Collins specifically told me not to touch that glass. Several guests exchanged looks. Interesting, very interesting. Marcus wrote something down. When was this? Around an hour before the camera outage. Another piece. Another connection. Richard's breathing seemed slightly heavier now. Still controlled, but heavier. Then, for the first time all evening, Margaret Wilson stepped forward. The movement alone shocked several employees. Margaret rarely inserted herself into conflict. Never publicly. Never during important events. Yet, here she was. The silver-haired house manager carefully set down her serving tray. The metal rattled softly against a nearby table. The sound echoed through the room. Margaret looked directly at Brandon. Not Richard. Brandon, her employer of 25 years. the man she had watched grow from a young executive into one of Chicago's most powerful businessmen. "I need to say something." Brandon nodded. "Go ahead." Margaret drew a slow breath. Victoria noticed her hands trembling. Not dramatically, just enough to reveal how difficult this moment was. Margaret finally spoke. "Earlier tonight, I heard Richard say something." Richard immediately stiffened. The reaction was impossible to miss. Margaret continued. "He said nobody notices what the staff carries." A murmur spread through the crowd. Several employees exchanged glances. Some had heard the same comment, others clearly hadn't. Margaret kept going. "I didn't think much of it at first." She looked down briefly, then back at Brandon. "But after the documents disappeared, after the cameras failed, after the key was found," she paused. The room waited. "I think he said it because he believed people like us were invisible." Silence, heavy silence. Brandon's face hardened. Richard looked furious. Not openly furious, controlled furious, dangerous furious. Marcus took notes. Emily watched Richard carefully, very carefully. Then another surprise arrived. One of the estate technicians hurried into the ballroom, breathing hard, holding a tablet. The man approached Marcus first, then Brandon. "Sir?" Brandon turned. "What is it?" The technician looked uncertain, as though he wasn't sure whether he should speak in front of everyone. Marcus nodded. "Go ahead." The technician swallowed. "We recovered footage from a secondary camera." Richard's face lost color. Instantly, Victoria saw it. Emily saw it. Everyone saw it. A secondary camera. Brandon frowned. The technician nodded. "It wasn't part of the hallway system." Hope appeared in Emily's eyes. "What did it record?" The technician turned the tablet around. People crowded closer. Victoria couldn't see the screen clearly, but she watched the adults' reactions. That told her enough. Marcus leaned forward. Emily's eyes widened. Brandon became completely still. The technician spoke. "The camera is located inside the flower preparation room." Richard slowly closed his eyes. Just for a moment. The technician continued. "It doesn't directly face the hallway." Everyone waited. But a mirror inside the room reflected part of the corridor. The room exploded with whispers. Richard looked like a man watching the floor collapse beneath him. Marcus turned toward him. "What does the footage show?" the technician answered. "It shows Mr. Collins placing something inside the glass." Silence. Absolute silence. The kind that hurts your ears. Richard's mouth opened, then closed. No explanation came, no denial came, nothing. Because everyone already understood. Victoria looked toward Brandon. The billionaire's jaw clenched. Hard. For the first time that evening, genuine anger appeared. Not loud anger, not explosive anger, the kind that becomes dangerous because it stays quiet. Marcus carefully took the tablet, reviewed the footage himself, then nodded. Once. Only once. That was enough. The evidence was real, undeniable. The room shifted. Guests who had been uncertain no longer looked uncertain. Employees who had remained silent no longer looked confused. The balance had changed. Completely. Richard understood it too. His eyes moved rapidly, searching, calculating, looking for escape, looking for options, finding none. Then Brandon spoke. His voice felt colder than the lake outside. "Open the safe." Everyone turned. Marcus nodded. A security supervisor immediately moved toward the office corridor. "The key is incomplete," someone said. Emily stepped forward. "There is a backup key." The room froze again. Richard's eyes widened. A tiny reaction. Yet Victoria caught it. Fear. Real fear. Not fear of embarrassment, not fear of suspicion, fear of what would be found. Emily continued. The backup key is held by our legal office. Marcus looked at Brandon. Brandon nodded. Get it? Phones came out. Calls were made. Instructions were given. Everything moved quickly now. Richard no longer seemed like the man who had controlled the evening. He looked cornered, trapped, exposed. Victoria watched him carefully. Then she noticed something strange. His shoes. A faint white dust clung near one sole, barely visible. Most people would never have seen it. Victoria narrowed her eyes. White dust, paper dust. Almost like the residue left behind after something had been shredded. A strange feeling returned. The same feeling she had experienced all evening. The feeling that one final piece was still missing. The key mattered. The footage mattered. But something inside the safe mattered even more. And somehow, Richard already knew exactly what that something was. The ballroom no longer felt like a place for celebration. It felt like a place where the truth had finally decided to show itself. Outside, wind rolled across Lake Michigan. The dark water struck the shoreline below the estate. Inside, nobody seemed interested in the fundraiser anymore. Every eye remained fixed on Richard Collins. And Richard knew it. The confidence that had carried him through the evening was gone. The polished smile, gone. The smooth explanations, gone. The certainty, gone. All that remained was a man running out of places to hide. The backup key arrived 20 minutes later. A member of Brandon Powell's legal team rushed into the estate carrying a secured case. The room remained tense. Nobody left. Nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Brandon stood beside Marcus Reed. Emily remained nearby. Margaret watched from the back. Victoria stood next to her mother. The little girl felt Angela's hand resting gently on her shoulder. Protective, comforting, steady. The legal representative opened the case. Inside sat the backup key, a genuine safe key, untouched, documented, verified. Marcus inspected it, then nodded. Let's do this. The group moved toward Brandon's private office. Guests followed at a respectful distance. The hallway felt colder than before. The air smelled faintly of wood polish and printer toner. Every footstep echoed against the walls. Richard walked too. He didn't have a choice. Two security supervisors remained close by, not restraining him, just watching. The office door opened. Victoria immediately recognized the room. The same room where she had found the paper scrap. The same room where Richard had entered earlier. The same room, connected to everything. Brandon stepped inside. His face remained unreadable. Marcus approached the large safe built into the wall behind a framed painting. The metal looked cold beneath the office lights. Heavy, immovable. The detective inserted the backup key. A soft click echoed through the room, then another. The handle turned. The safe opened. Silence. Absolute silence. Everyone leaned forward. Inside sat several folders, legal documents, financial records, donation contracts. But something was wrong, very wrong. Emily noticed first, the donor ledger. Marcus looked at her. What about it? It should be here. The room tightened. Emily stepped closer. Her hands moved carefully through the files. Then she looked at her father. It's gone. Nobody spoke. The missing ledger. The same ledger Victoria had seen referenced on the scrap of paper. The original donor ledger. Gone. Richard immediately seized the opportunity. You see, his voice rose quickly. If the ledger is missing, someone else must have taken it. Marcus slowly turned toward him. The detective's expression remained calm, almost too calm. Maybe. Richard nodded eagerly. Exactly. But Marcus wasn't finished. Then let's keep looking. The hope vanished from Richard's face again, because Marcus wasn't defending him. He was eliminating possibilities, one by one. Victoria quietly watched Richard. Then she saw it again, the white dust, still visible near the edge of his shoe, tiny, almost invisible. But there, the little girl stared, then remembered something. A sound. Earlier, near the office. A sound she hadn't understood at the time. Not metal, not a drawer, paper, lots of paper, a shredding sound. A memory flashed through her mind. Her eyes widened. Meanwhile, Marcus continued examining the office. Nothing seemed out of place, at first. Then Emily pointed toward a waste cabinet. The cabinet door stood slightly open. Marcus approached, opened it fully. Inside sat a commercial paper shredder. The machine was still warm. Very warm. The room froze. Brandon's jaw clenched. Marcus carefully opened the shredder collection bin. Shredded paper filled the container. Hundreds of strips, thousands. The detective crouched, picked up a handful, examined them, then slowly stood. No one spoke. Richard looked pale, very pale. The detective handed several strips to Emily. She studied them. Then her expression changed. The ledger. The words barely escaped her lips. Brandon closed his eyes. Just for a moment, Victoria saw his shoulders rise and fall, a slow breath, a painful breath. Not because of money, not because of business, because of betrayal. Real betrayal. The kind that comes from someone you trusted, someone you defended, someone you allowed into your life. Marcus continued his work. Methodical, patient, professional. The shredded documents were carefully collected, photographed, preserved. The process took time. Nobody rushed. Nobody needed to. The evidence was already overwhelming. Yet one question remained. Why destroy the ledger? Emily answered it first. She moved toward a nearby desk, opened a financial report, compared figures. Then another report, then another. The lawyer inside her had awakened completely. The room watched. Several minutes passed. Then she looked up. Her face had gone white. "What is it?" Brandon asked. Emily swallowed. The donations. What about them? She slowly laid several pages across the desk. Marcus stepped closer. So did Brandon. The money wasn't going where it was supposed to. Silence. Emily pointed at the records. Multiple transfers. Marcus followed the trail. Several shell companies. Several hidden accounts. Several layers of transactions. Enough to hide millions. Brandon stared at the pages. His hands tightened into fists. Richard lowered his head. For the first time all evening he said nothing. Nothing at all, because there was nothing left to say. The evidence spoke louder than any explanation. The hidden key, the camera outage, the shredded ledger, the shell companies, the money. Everything connected. Everything pointed to one person. Marcus finally looked toward Richard. "Mr. Collins." Richard remained silent. The detective continued. "You'll need to come with us." The words landed softly. No dramatic shouting, no movie scene, no chaos, just procedure. Reality. 2 officers stepped forward. Richard slowly raised his eyes. For a brief moment he looked toward Brandon, perhaps searching for mercy, perhaps searching for support. He found neither. Brandon simply looked back at him. Cold. Disappointed. Done. The officers escorted Richard from the room. The crowd outside parted silently. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. Because some victories don't feel joyful. They simply feel necessary. After Richard disappeared down the hallway, silence returned. A different silence, a lighter one, the kind that follows a storm. Brandon finally turned toward Victoria. The little girl stood quietly beside her mother. No triumph, no pride, just relief. Brandon walked toward them. Slowly, carefully. The billionaire stopped in front of Angela first, then Victoria. "I owe both of you an apology." The words surprised everyone, especially the guests listening nearby. Brandon continued, "You came here to work." Angela lowered her eyes. "And instead, you were treated unfairly." Victoria looked up at him. Brandon nodded. "You were telling the truth." Victoria didn't smile. She simply nodded back, because she had known that all along. Several weeks later, Brandon would take concrete action. Not charity, not pity, action. Angela would receive a permanent position within the Powell Foundation Facilities Division, with benefits, health care, stability. Victoria would receive a scholarship through a fully audited education program approved by the Foundation's board, not because she solved a mystery, but because her academic records showed exceptional promise, and because opportunities should be earned fairly. Most importantly, the Powell Foundation would undergo an independent financial audit. Complete transparency, no exceptions, no shortcuts, no blind trust. As the office slowly emptied, Brandon remained standing near the open safe. Then something caught his eye. A small envelope hidden behind one of the remaining folders. Yellowed with age, his name written across the front. In familiar handwriting. Sarah's handwriting. His late wife's handwriting. Brandon carefully picked it up. The room fell silent again, because everyone knew one thing. Whatever was inside that letter was about to change something important. 6 weeks later, the first snow of the season drifted across Chicago. Small white flakes floated through the cold morning air. Cars moved slowly along the streets. Store windows glowed with warm light. Life continued. But for many people connected to the Powell Foundation, life looked different now. Much different. The investigation into Richard Collins had expanded beyond the events of that single evening. Financial specialists reviewed records. Independent auditors examined transactions. Law enforcement traced money through shell companies and hidden accounts. The process was slow, careful, professional, no miracles, no shortcuts. Just the steady work of uncovering the truth. Millions of dollars had been diverted from programs intended to help struggling families. Not all of it could be recovered immediately, but a significant portion had already been frozen and redirected back through legal channels. The damage had been stopped, and that mattered. Inside the Powell Foundation headquarters, change was visible everywhere. New oversight policies, independent reviews, multiple approval requirements, transparency measures. People no longer relied on blind trust. They relied on accountability. Brandon Powell insisted on it. Every single meeting began with the same principle. Trust is valuable. Verification is necessary. Nobody argued. Not anymore. Across town, Angela Johnson's life had become more stable. Not perfect, but stable. For the first time in years, she didn't have to worry about losing temporary jobs every few weeks. Her new position with the foundation came with health insurance, regular hours, predictable income. The changes seemed small to some people. To Angela, they meant everything. One evening, she stood in her apartment kitchen preparing dinner. The smell of tomato soup filled the room. Steam rose from the stove. Victoria sat at the table finishing homework. Angela paused for a moment, just watching her daughter. The apartment wasn't larger, the furniture wasn't newer, the walls weren't different. Yet something felt lighter. The fear that had followed her for years no longer sat on her shoulders every morning. That alone felt priceless. Meanwhile, Victoria remained exactly who she had always been. She didn't become famous. She didn't appear on television. She didn't suddenly transform into a celebrity. In fact, most people outside the foundation never learned her name, and Victoria preferred it that way. She still loved books, still watched people carefully, still asked questions adults sometimes struggled to answer. The scholarship she received through the foundation helped pay for educational programs she had already qualified for. Nothing was handed to her unfairly. Nothing magical happened. Opportunity simply met preparation, the way it should. One Saturday afternoon, Victoria received an invitation. A small gathering at the Powell estate. No reporters, no publicity, no cameras. Just a few people. People whose lives had crossed because of one extraordinary evening. The lake looked gray beneath winter clouds when Victoria and Angela arrived. The estate felt different now. Less intimidating, more human. The giant gates still stood. The mansion remained impressive. Yet Victoria no longer saw wealth first. She saw people. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air. A fire crackled inside one of the sitting rooms. Margaret Wilson greeted them at the entrance. The older woman smiled warmly. A genuine smile. Not the tired smile Victoria remembered from the fundraiser. "You've gotten taller," Victoria laughed. "I think that's impossible in 6 weeks." Margaret chuckled. "You'd be surprised." A few minutes later, they entered the library. Brandon Powell stood near the fireplace. Emily sat nearby reviewing foundation reports. Several scholarship recipients and community leaders were also present. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed for publicity. Just people. Brandon walked over immediately. He shook Angela's hand first, then Victoria's. Exactly the same way he would greet any respected guest. No special treatment. No pity, respect, simple respect. The conversation flowed naturally. People discussed community projects, education programs, housing assistance initiatives. The foundation had launched a new program inspired by an idea Brandon had rediscovered while reading the letter found inside the safe. Sarah Powell's letter. The letter had not contained financial secrets. It contained something more important. A reminder. Years earlier, Sarah had written about children whose families often felt invisible. Children who needed someone willing to listen before judging. Children whose voices deserved attention even when adults were busy. Brandon had forgotten that program after Sarah's death. The pressure of business, the weight of grief, time, life. Somehow it had slipped away. Now it was returning. The new initiative would provide educational support, tutoring resources, and legal assistance for families facing housing instability. Practical help. Real help. The kind Sarah believed in. The kind Brandon should never have forgotten. Later that afternoon, most guests drifted toward the windows overlooking the lake. Only Brandon and Victoria remained near the fireplace. For a few moments, neither spoke. The fire crackled softly. Warm orange light danced across the room. Finally, Brandon smiled. "I have a question." Victoria looked up. "What is it?" He leaned back slightly. "Why didn't you stop?" She blinked. "What do you mean?" "When nobody believed you," he paused. "When adults ignored you." Another pause. "When it would have been easier to stay quiet." Victoria thought carefully. Just as she always did. The room remained still. Finally, she answered. "Because truth gets lonely when everybody walks away." The words settled into the silence. Simple, childlike, yet powerful. Brandon looked toward the fire. For a moment he remembered Sarah, the same belief, the same values, the same quiet courage. Then he looked back at Victoria and understood something. The little girl hadn't saved the foundation because she was extraordinary. She had saved it because she paid attention, because she stayed honest, because she spoke when silence would have been easier. The qualities were simple. That was what made them so rare. Outside, snow continued falling over Chicago. Inside, people laughed together. Plans were being made, lives were moving forward. Not perfectly, not magically, but honestly. And sometimes honesty changes more lives than power ever can. Sometimes the people with the smallest voices notice the biggest truths. In everyday life, it's easy to overlook children workers, elderly people, or anyone who seems to have less power than others. Yet, wisdom, honesty, and courage are not measured by wealth status or job titles. Victoria's story reminds us that being right is not always enough. Sometimes telling the truth requires persistence, especially when nobody wants to listen. It takes courage to speak up when others dismiss you, and it takes character to continue speaking even when people doubt you. The story also teaches an important lesson about respect. Every person deserves dignity. A person's value is not determined by their income, their clothes, or where they live. The moment we begin treating some people as invisible, we risk missing the truth standing right in front of us. Finally, real kindness is more than generosity. Real kindness means creating fairness, correcting mistakes, and making sure opportunities are available to those who earn them. If this story touched you, share in the comments what lesson stayed with you the most. And if you believe honesty, courage, and kindness still matter in today's world, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more inspiring stories. This is a work of fiction created for storytelling and entertainment purposes.